The air in the Grand Hall of the United Nations General Assembly in New York was thick with an almost suffocating formality. World leaders, diplomats and the international press filled the space, a sea of dark suits and hushed expectations. Ibrahim Traoré, the captain and transitional head of state of Burkina Faso, was present, a young, austere figure among more seasoned statesmen. It was one of his first appearances at a global forum of such magnitude since his country's transition, and the weight of scrutiny was palpable. The theme of the day was democracy and stability in crisis regions. Hillary Clinton, former U.S. Secretary of State and an influential voice in international politics, had been invited as the keynote speaker. Her presence always attracted attention, and today was no exception. When she took the podium, an expectant hush fell over the room. Her speech began with an eloquent analysis of the challenges to global democracy, but quickly narrowed to the situation in West Africa, and specifically, Burkina Faso. With the surgical precision of a seasoned lawyer and the authority of someone who has been at the center of global power, Clinton began to dissect the political situation in Burkina Faso. While we applaud the aspirations for change and more responsive governance, she declared, her voice ringing clearly through the speakers, we cannot turn a blind eye when democratic transition is replaced by gun laws. We cannot remain silent when young officials, however well-intentioned they may seem, seize power by force, suspending constitutions and promising a future that can only be legitimately built through the popular vote, not at the barrel of a gun. The eyes of many in the room, including the media cameras, turned subtly to Ibrahim Traoré. He remained impassive, his face a mask of stoicism, but a careful observer would have noticed the tension in his jaw, the slight hardening of his gaze. Clinton continued, her words becoming more direct, almost personal. The international community has invested billions in supporting democracy and development in nations like Burkina Faso. We hope to see a return on that investment, not in terms of geopolitical alignment, but in terms of respect for human rights, the rule of law, and a clear and rapid path back to civilian rule. Leadership is not just about having the courage to seize power, it is about having the wisdom and humility to return it to the people. She paused, looking directly at the Burkinabe delegation. Empty promises and anti-imperialist rhetoric may fire up the streets for a while, but they do not build lasting institutions or feed hungry children. The word humiliation might be strong, but the effect was undeniable. It was a public, scathing criticism, coming from a prominent figure, on the biggest stage in the world. Traoré felt the heat rise to his face, but he maintained his composure. The message was clear, for figures like Clinton and for a significant part of the international community, he was seen as just another military leader in a continent already marked by them, his justifications for taking power ringing hollow to Western ears. When the speech ended, there was formal applause. Traoré and his delegation rose and left the hall in dignified silence, but the buzz of the press was already audible. The headlines that evening would no doubt be about Clinton's rebuke or challenge of the young leader of Burkina Faso. The humiliation was complete before the eyes of the world. The journey back to Ouagadougou was long and silent. Ibrahim Traoré barely spoke, his thoughts a whirlwind. His initial anger, the sense of injustice at what he considered a gross and arrogant simplification of his country's complex reality, began to give way to a colder and more bitter reflection. Clinton's words, as painful as they were, echoed certain criticisms he had heard, albeit more veiled, from other foreign ministries. By the time he landed, news of the incident at the UN had spread like wildfire. His closest advisors were divided. Some, more passionate, advocated a tough response, a public statement denouncing Western interference and hypocrisy. Others, more pragmatic, advised caution, suggesting that any direct confrontation would only further isolate the country. Traoré listened to everyone, but remained introspective. He knew that a war of words would achieve nothing. It would not change international perception and, more importantly, it would not solve any of Burkina Faso's pressing problems. The public humiliation, however, had touched a nerve. Not so much because of his personal pride, but because of the way it reflected on the image of his nation, the image of a people he felt compelled to defend and uplift. In the following days, he isolated himself more than usual. Meetings were postponed, public appearances cancelled. The silence in the presidential palace was heavy, and speculation began to arise in the capital. Was the captain shaken? Preparing a change of direction? Or simply consolidating his power internally before any external movement? In his long hours of solitude, Traoré would revisit Clinton's words. Empty promises, do not build institutions, do not feed hungry children. He knew that his seizure of power had been an extreme measure, born of the conviction that the country was on the brink of an abyss, betrayed by a corrupt and ineffective elite. But he also knew that the military's legitimacy was tenuous, and that the trust of his people needed to be won not just with talk of sovereignty but with concrete actions that would improve their lives. Criticisms about the lack of a clear path to civilian rule, about the danger of authoritarianism, these were valid concerns, even if expressed in hostile terms. Perhaps, he thought, the answer lay not in refuting Clinton's words but in demonstrating, in an undeniable and surprising way, the true purpose of his leadership. A response that was not to Hillary Clinton or to the international community, but to the Burkinabe people. A response that the world would, by chance, witness. An idea began to take shape, an idea that ran counter to all expectations of how a military leader, especially one who had just been publicly criticized, should respond. It would not be a new security plan, nor a grand economic announcement, nor a hasty constitutional reform. It would be something much more fundamental, something that spoke directly to the hearts and dignity of his people. And something that, he hoped, the world could not easily ignore or distort. A week after the UN incident, Ibrahim Traoré called a national and international press conference in Ouagadougou. Expectations were high. Many expected an anti-Western diatribe or, at the very least, a vehement defense of his actions. What they heard, however, left everyone perplexed. With a calm that contrasted with the storm of the previous week, Traoré did not mention Hillary Clinton or the episode at the UN directly. Instead, he spoke of the dignity of the Burkinabe people. He spoke of the need for self-sufficiency, not only in terms of security or the economy, but also in terms of civic spirit and national pride. There are challenges that no outside help can solve for us, he said, his voice firm. There are jobs that only we can and must do ourselves. We have been reminded recently, perhaps undiplomatically, of the responsibilities of leadership and the needs of our people. And that reminder, though harsh, serves to refocus us on the essentials. Then he announced Operation Salmaama, Operation Dignity. Starting next week, Traoré continued, together with members of the government, defense and security forces, and I call on all citizens of Ouagadougou, and later of other cities, to join us in a national day of civic work. Let us clean our streets, repair our schools and health clinics with our own resources and our own hands. Let us paint our public buildings, plant trees where there is aridity, and show the world, but especially ourselves, what we are capable of when we are united by a common purpose. There was a stunned silence in the room, followed by a murmur of disbelief. A day of national cleansing? Led by the head of state? Was this the grand answer to international criticism? A few foreign journalists exchanged skeptical, almost disdainful glances. It seemed naive. Simplistic. But Traoré wasn't done. This is not a one-off event. It will be the beginning of a movement. A movement to rekindle our civic pride, to strengthen our community ties and to build our nation from the bottom up, with the sweat of each and every one of us. True sovereignty begins with the dignity of our environment and our work. The following Saturday, Ouagadougou woke to an extraordinary sight. Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in simple work clothes, not his military uniform, stood in the central square of one of the city's most populous and neglected neighborhoods, the Gaunfin quartier. At his side were ministers, generals, soldiers, but also students, shopkeepers, housewives, all armed with brooms, shovels, buckets of paint and tree saplings. Traoré made no speeches. He simply picked up a broom and began sweeping a trash-strewn sidewalk. He picked up a shovel and helped clear a clogged drainage ditch. He joined a group painting the faded wall of an elementary school. He worked in the hot sun, sweating, talking to ordinary citizens, listening to their concerns, laughing with them. The image was powerful and deeply unexpected. It wasn't a performance act for the cameras, though they were there, initially skeptical, then increasingly intrigued. He was a leader working side by side with his people, without pomp, without distance. It was an act of humility and service that contrasted sharply with the image of a military autocrat that some tried to paint. People who initially watched from their homes, curious or suspicious, began to gather. An old carpenter brought his tools and began to repair broken benches in the square. A group of women organized the distribution of water and food to the workers. Young people, who may have previously felt purposeless, have found common cause. The Operation Salmaama has become a contagion of positive energy. As news of these unusual scenes began to spread beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, many around the globe wondered what was really going on. Which country are you following this story from? Comment below which country you are from. We would love to hear where our audience is from and what they think about this. Traoré's response was beginning to surprise, not for its grandiloquence, but for its radical simplicity. By the end of that first day, parts of Gaoufeng had been visibly transformed. But the most significant change was not physical. It was the sparkle in people's eyes, the sense of shared accomplishment, the rediscovery of community pride. Traoré, exhausted but serene, thanked everyone. This, he said, his voice hoarse, is Burkina Faso. This is our response. The Operation Salmaama did not stop in Gaoufeng, nor in Ouagadougou. Over the following weekends, the movement spread to other towns and villages in Burkina Faso. In Bobo Dioulasso, citizens and soldiers worked together to renovate the central market. In Kaya, a tree-planting campaign was launched to combat desertification. In each location, the presence of Ibrahim Traoré, or his closest ministers, actively participating, was a catalyst. The international media, initially inclined to see the initiative as a PR stunt or an eccentricity, began to change its tune. The images were undeniable. A national leader literally getting his hands dirty, mobilizing his people not for war or political demonstrations but for constructive community work. It was a narrative that defied stereotypes. Opinion pieces began to appear, questioning whether the initial criticism of Traoré had been hasty or based on prejudice. Political analysts debated broom diplomacy or servant leadership as a new form of soft power. Some remained skeptical, but grudging admiration was growing. Inside Burkina Faso, the impact was profound. Operation Dignity did not solve the security crisis or endemic poverty, but it created a sense of national unity and purpose rarely seen. It gave people a tangible way to contribute, to feel that they were part of the solution, not just the problem. It temporarily eased internal political tensions, as the focus shifted to common, visible goals. The most surprising reaction was from some sectors of the youth. Many young people, previously cynical or apathetic towards politics, were attracted to Traoré's practical and direct approach. Seeing a leader their own age, who spoke their language and shared their physical struggle, was inspiring. Small civic initiative groups began to spring up spontaneously, inspired by Salmaama. There was no direct response from Hillary Clinton. She has not publicly retracted her statement or made any further comments. But in the corridors of diplomacy, the tone toward Burkina Faso has begun to subtly change. Delegations from other African countries, and even some Western non-governmental organizations, have expressed interest in learning more about Operation Salmaama. The real test came when a small northern town, plagued by drought and sporadic insurgent attacks, asked for help rebuilding its only school, which had been damaged. Traoré not only sent military materials and engineers, but went himself, spending 2 days working with local residents under tight security. The images of that act, of a leader risking his life to help rebuild a school in a conflict zone, had an even greater global impact. It was no longer just about cleaning up streets, it was about rebuilding hope in the most hopeless places. The world began to see Ibrahim Traoré not just as a young captain who seized power, but as a leader who, faced with humiliation on the world stage, chose to respond not with anger or rhetoric, but with an extraordinary display of service and dedication to his people. A response that was, at its core, deeply Burkinabe, but one that resonated universally. Months passed. Operation Salmaama had become an informal institution in Burkina Faso, a constant reminder of the power of collective action. Ibrahim Traoré continued to face immense challenges: the fight against terrorism, the need for economic reforms, the pressure to meet electoral deadlines. But something fundamental had changed in the perception of his leadership, both internally and externally. The humiliation at the UN, which could have been a devastating setback, paradoxically became a catalyst for one of the most defining moments of his early presidency. He had not defeated Hillary Clinton in a debate of words. He had shown the world, and more importantly, his own people, that a leader's true strength lies not in his ability to dominate or retaliate, but in his willingness to serve and inspire others to do the same. Traoré's surprising response was not a carefully calculated public relations strategy, although its effects were notable in that field. It was born from a genuine conviction that the dignity of a nation begins with the dignity of its citizens and the environment in which they live. And that sometimes the most powerful response to external criticism is a profound, transformative act of internal self-affirmation. The world, which had expected a typical reaction from a military leader under pressure, witnessed something different: humility in action, leadership by example, and a form of patriotism that manifested itself not in slogans but in calluses on hands and sweat on brows. Surprise gave way to reassessment, and in many corners, a grudging but growing respect. Ibrahim Traoré learned in that episode that words can hurt, that the world scene can be merciless, but that concrete action, rooted in the needs and aspirations of the people themselves, has a power that transcends rhetoric and criticism. Operation Salmaama was not the solution to all of Burkina Faso's problems, but it was a powerful symbol of resilience, unity, and the relentless pursuit of dignity. And that, perhaps, was the most lasting legacy of that unexpected humiliation and the even more surprising response that followed. Did this story make you think about different forms of leadership? Subscribe on the channel for more impactful narratives about figures who shape our world. Share this story with anyone interested in international politics and human responses to great challenges, and leave your like. See you in the next video.